By the winter of 1944, the illusion that the war was something distant, fought in foreign fields, waged by soldiers far from home, was shattered for millions of German civilians. For nearly 5 years, life in many parts of the Reich had remained strangely insulated. Bombing raids had scarred cities and rationing had bitten into daily life. But for those in East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, the war had seemed like something happening beyond the horizon. The newspapers and radio broadcasts still spoke of victory, of heroic stands on the Eastern Front, of the Wehrmacht holding firm against the Red Army. But the front lines were moving west, and with them came an unstoppable tide that would soon sweep into towns and villages that had never imagined they would become battlefields. In January 1945, that tide arrived. The Red Army's Vistula Oder offensive broke through German defenses with overwhelming force, crossing rivers and frozen plains at a pace that stunned even seasoned commanders. Entire divisions collapsed under the weight of Soviet artillery barges and tank spearheads. Civilians who had once cheered their soldiers off to war now packed carts with whatever possessions they could carry, joining endless columns of refugees trudging westward through snow and ice. Mothers pushed children in wheelbarrows, old men hobbled on canes, and wagons creaked under piles of bedding, clothing, and heirlooms. The roads were choked with humanity, yet the front advanced faster than anyone could flee. For many, there was nowhere to go. Trains were filled beyond capacity, often commandeered by retreating military units. Roads were bombed or blocked. Some towns were surrounded before evacuation orders could even be issued. Others chose to stay, clinging to belief that civilian women and children would be spared the worst, that there were still rules, still lines that even a vengeful enemy would not cross. Those illusions did not survive first contact. Soviet soldiers, hardened by 3 years of brutal warfare on their own soil, saw not civilians but the faces of their tormentors. Many had lost families to German bombs and bullets, their villages burned, their homes razed. Propaganda had taught them that Germans, not just Hitler or the SS, were collectively responsible for the suffering of the Soviet people. Now, with the Red Army on German soil, vengeance was no longer an abstract concept. It was marching street by street, house by house. Villages that had been quiet farming communities became scenes of chaos overnight. Soviet troops stormed into barns and basements, pulling out those who had hidden from the fighting. Families were separated without explanation, their possessions rifled through or stolen outright. The sound of boots on wooden floors shouted commands in Russian and a dull thud of rifle, but against doors replaced the rhythms of everyday life. Women who had never been closer to the war than the ration queue now found themselves face to face with soldiers who saw them as spoils, enemies, or both. The eastern provinces of Germany had never imagined they would experience occupation firsthand. They had been part of the Reich since before most could remember. Their towns were filled with church spires and cobblestone streets, their farms with orchards and livestock. Now they were being transformed into staging grounds for Soviet offensives and punishment zones for the atrocities committed in the East. Rumors of what happened in places like Nemmersdorf, where Soviet troops had massacred civilians, spread quickly, often exaggerated, but grounded in truth. Fear became a daily companion, as did the grim realization that the war was no longer something happening elsewhere. For women, especially, the ground beneath them shifted in ways that would shape the rest of their lives. Many were alone, their husbands, fathers, and brothers still fighting or already dead. They were left to protect children, elderly parents, and themselves as frontline chaos descended on their homes. There were no instructions of what to do when the soldiers arrived, no guidance from a collapsing state that was itself retreating westward. Neighbors whispered about hiding places, about false papers, about the need to burn anything that might link them to the Nazi Party. But none of it guaranteed safety. By the spring of 1945, whole swaths of eastern Germany had been consumed by the war's final convulsions. Towns changed hands, were bombed into rubble, or were simply erased from maps. Civilians, once passive observers of a distant conflict, were now caught in its most violent and unforgiving phase. And for countless German women, the fall of the Eastern Front marked not just the end of the Third Reich, but the beginning of a new ordeal they would rarely speak of for the rest of their lives. The world they had known, one of routines, families, and fragile stability, was gone replaced by a reality defined by fear, survival, and the terrifying uncertainty of what awaited them next. The collapse of the Eastern Front in early 1945 unleashed one of the largest civilian migrations in European history. As Soviet forces advanced deeper into German territory, millions of civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, abandoned their homes in desperate attempts to escape westward. What began as a trickle of refugees from the easternmost provinces became a flood as word spread of villages overrun and civilians slaughtered. Entire communities vanished almost overnight, leaving behind smoldering hearths, scattered belongings, and empty streets as people loaded whatever they could carry onto carts, sleds, or even their backs. For many, the decision was made in haste and panic, sometimes with only minutes to spare before Soviet troops arrived. The journey was brutal from the very first step. In the depths of a harsh winter, temperatures plunged far below freezing, and snowdrifts blanketed the roads that led west. The main routes became clogged with columns of humanity stretching for miles, women wrapped in blankets pushing prams filled not with babies but with pots and family heirlooms, children trudging barefoot beside horse-drawn wagons, old men leaning heavily on walking sticks. Livestock were often hitched to makeshift carts piled high with mattresses, furniture, and food. But as the tide of refugees grew, the roads themselves became treacherous obstacles, choked with ice, debris, and abandoned belongings. Wheels broke, animals died, and entire convoys ground to a halt in the frozen mud. Those who fell behind risked being overtaken by the Red Army, and stories spread of those caught in the open being executed on the spot or simply disappear without a trace. Trains offered a faster, if no less desperate, means of escape. At stations from Königsberg to Breslau, frantic crowds surged toward departing trains, climbing through windows and clinging to railings as locomotives pulled away. Passenger cars meant for dozens now carried hundreds, and even the roofs were lined with shivering figures clinging to whatever handholds they could find. Families were separated in the chaos, mothers losing sight of children, husbands waving helplessly from platforms as trains pulled away without them. Railway lines were frequent targets of Soviet aircraft, and more than one train filled with refugees was strafed or bombed en route. For those lucky enough to make it aboard, the journey was often agonizingly slow, with trains stopping for hours or days as damaged tracks were repaired or military transports were given priority. The exodus was haunted by rumors that grew more terrifying with every passing day. Stories of Soviet soldiers committing mass executions in East Prussia, of women raped in the streets, of civilians herded into barns and burned alive circulated among the refugees, some exaggerated, many based on grim reality. Each tale fueled the panic, compelling even those who once vowed to stay and defend their homes to join the tide moving west. Yet not everyone could leave. The sick and bedridden were often abandoned in their homes. Entire villages of elderly people who could not make the journey waited silently for whatever would come. Some chose to hide in basements and cellars, hoping the war would pass over them like a storm. Others surrendered themselves to Soviet authorities, clinging to the hope that civilians would be spared once the fighting stopped. The physical toll of the flight was immense. Exposure, exhaustion, and starvation claimed countless lives before the refugees ever reached safety. Roadsides became littered with frozen bodies, infants wrapped in shawls, old men collapsed in the snow, horses and oxen lied where they had fallen from exhaustion. Along the Baltic coast, thousands attempted to flee by sea, crowding onto ships bound for ports in the west. Many of these vessels were sunk by Soviet submarines or aircraft, including the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was torpedoed in January 1945, killing more than 9,000 people, most of them civilians. The tragedy of that sinking encapsulated the desperation and danger that marked every stage of the westward flight. For those who did manage to escape, safety was often an illusion. Cities like Dresden and Berlin, once considered refuges, soon became battlegrounds themselves. Food was scarce, shelter hard to find, and Allied air raids continued unabated. Yet for millions, these hardships were preferable to the alternative, being overtaken by the Red Army and facing whatever vengeance the Soviet soldiers might bring. Those who remained behind often did so not by choice but by circumstance. A broken wagon, an illness, a missed train, any of these can mean the difference between escape and capture. As the Soviet front line swept past, these civilians found themselves in transformed landscape, one where German authority had vanished overnight, and the rules of war were rewritten by the occupying forces. They were no longer citizens of the Reich, but subjects under foreign control, their fates uncertain, their future no longer their own. In the end, the Great Flight westward was not merely a movement of people, but a reckoning with the collapse of a nation. It was a physical manifestation of a war Germany had unleashed but could no longer control. For those trudging through the snow, it was not ideology or loyalty that mattered now, only the instinct to survive. And for the millions who could not run fast enough, surrender was not a choice, but an inevitability. By the time the Red Army crossed into German territory in late 1944, the war to the east had ceased to be a contest of armies alone. It had become a crusade of vengeance, fueled by years of suffering, hatred, and propaganda. Soviet soldiers did not see themselves merely as liberators pushing back fascism. They saw themselves as instruments of justice, delivering retribution to a nation that had burned their villages, slaughtered their families, and reduced their homeland to rubble. In that climate, the line between soldier and civilian blurred almost completely. To many Soviet troops, there were no innocent Germans. Every face they encountered, soldier, farmer, woman, or child, was part of the enemy machine that had invaded their land. This view had been cultivated deliberately and relentlessly by Soviet propaganda. From the earliest days of the German invasion in 1941, state media had framed the conflict not just as a fight against Hitler's armies, but against the German people as a whole. Posters, radio broadcasts, and newsreels hammered home the idea that every German shared responsibility for the horrors inflicted on Soviet soil. Civilians, they were told, had cheered on the Wehrmacht as it advanced. They had worked in the factories that built tanks and bombs. They had supported a system that treated Slavs as subhuman and sent millions of Soviet citizens into forced labor or death camps. By the time the Red Army was marching west, this message had hardened into a conviction. There was no such thing as a good German. The atrocities committed by the Wehrmacht and the SS in the Soviet Union gave these beliefs a brutal logic. Soldiers advancing toward Berlin passed through landscapes that bore the scars of a war fought with merciless cruelty. Entire towns had been wiped off the map. Mass graves dotted the countryside where German troops had executed partisans, prisoners, and civilians. Survivors told stories of families shot for hiding food, of children starved in ghettos, of villages burned as collective punishment. Red Army soldiers did not need propaganda to fuel their hatred. The evidence was everywhere they looked, and as they entered Germany, many believed they were simply returning the suffering in kind. This attitude shaped their behavior in ways that terrified the civilian population. Looting was rampant, driven not just by greed, but by a sense of entitlement. Soviet soldiers believed they had earned the right to take what they pleased from those who had taken so much from them. Watches, bicycles, livestock, furniture, anything that could be carried away disappeared into military convoys heading east. Even more devastating was a wave of sexual violence that swept through occupied territories. Women of every age, from teenagers to the elderly, were assaulted, often repeatedly, as soldiers vented their rage and asserted their dominance. These acts were not just crimes of passion or opportunity. They were expressions of power, humiliation, and revenge against a population seen as complicit in the suffering of the Soviet people. For Soviet authorities, this behavior was officially condemned, but often tacitly tolerated. Commanders issued orders reminding troops that civilians were not to be harmed, but enforcement was inconsistent and often non-existent. In many cases, officers looked the other way, seeing such acts as the inevitable consequence of war, or even as part of the punishment Germany deserved. Joseph Stalin himself reportedly remarked that soldiers should be allowed their fun after years of hardship and deprivation. In this climate, accountability was rare, and the suffering of civilians continued largely unchecked. For German women, this perception of collective guilt was devastating. Many had spent the war far from the front, raising children or working in small-town shops. Some had been critical of the Nazi regime, others indifferent. Yet none of that mattered now. They were German, and that alone made them targets. Attempts to reason with soldiers, to explain that they had not supported Hitler, that they had lost husbands and sons too, fell on deaf ears. In the eyes of the victors, they were not individuals but embodiments of a nation that had sought to destroy theirs. This collective punishment extended beyond violence. Civilians were rounded up and sent to labor camps in the Soviet Union, often without trial or explanation. Entire villages were forced to work clearing rubble or dismantling factories for shipment east. Property was seized, homes were requisitioned, and cultural treasures were looted under the guise of reparations. It was a systematic dismantling of a defeated society. Vengeance made policy. The result was a landscape of fear and silence. Women avoided soldiers whenever possible, hiding in cellars or dressing in rags to appear less noticeable. Mothers smeared soot on their daughters' faces to make them look older or less attractive. But such measures offered only limited protection. The belief that every German shared responsibility for Nazi crimes made mercy rare and compassion almost non-existent. In the post-war years, few survivors spoke openly about what they endured. The shame was too deep, the trauma too raw. Yet beneath the silence lay a bitter truth. For the Red Army, the war was not truly over until the German people, every last one, had felt a measure of the suffering they had inflicted. And for millions of civilians, that meant that defeat was not just the end of the Third Reich. It was the beginning of a punishment they had never imagined would reach them. The arrival of the Red Army in Germany was not marked by a single moment of conquest, but by a series of abrupt and terrifying intrusions that shattered the rhythm of civilian life. It began with distant sounds, the low thunder of artillery, the metallic growl of tanks, the staccato burst of machine gun fire rolling closer with each passing hour. For weeks, people in the eastern provinces had been told the front was still far away, that the Wehrmacht would hold the line. But when the first Soviet patrols appeared at the edge of towns in East Prussia or Silesia, the illusion collapsed instantly. What followed was not an orderly occupation, but a chaotic, often violent collision between conqueror and conquered. The first soldiers usually arrived in small, tense groups, scouts and forward patrols with weapons raised, shouting orders in a language few civilians understood. They moved through empty streets with suspicion, smashing doors open with rifle butts, kicking down cellar doors, and dragging terrified families into the open. Many households had already prepared for this moment. Windows had been shuttered, valuables hidden, family photographs burned to erase traces of Nazi affiliation. Women dressed themselves in their oldest, dirtiest clothes and smeared soot across their faces to appear older. Mothers instructed their daughters not to make eye contact with soldiers. But nothing could disguise the fact that they were German, and in that moment, that was enough. House-to-house searches became the first act of occupation. Soldiers stormed into homes, overturning furniture, ripping open cupboards, prying up floorboards in search of weapons, documents, or valuables. Radios and typewriters were often confiscated, suspected of being tools for communication or propaganda. Photographs of men in uniform were taken as evidence of complicity, no matter how distant the connection. Even letters or diaries could be enough to warrant attention. There were no explanations, no warrants, no legal procedures. Accusations were shouted in Russian, verdicts delivered at gunpoint. It was common for men and women alike to be dragged from their homes with no clear reason. Some were accused of being spies because they possessed a map. Others were branded collaborators because they worked for the post office or local administration. Most were simply taken because they were German. Entire families disappeared overnight, loaded into trucks or herded down roads under armed escort toward makeshift holding areas, schools, barns, town halls, that had been converted into temporary prisons. In many cases, detainees were separated immediately. Men sent in one direction, women and children in another. Few knew where they were going, and fewer still returned quickly. The breakdown of order was total. Police forces had disintegrated or fled, and any remnants of German civil authority were powerless to intervene. Looting became rampant, not just by soldiers but by desperate civilians scavenging abandoned homes. Shops were emptied, livestock slaughtered, and warehouses stripped bare. The occupying soldiers took what they wanted: furniture, watches, bicycles, even entire pianos, loading them onto wagons bound for the east as reparations. Farmers watched helplessly as their horses were requisitioned for Soviet artillery units. In some towns, Soviet commanders attempted to impose discipline, issuing curfews and threatening punishment for disorder. But these orders often carried little weight in the chaos of a frontline occupation. For women, the danger was immediate and constant. Soviet soldiers, emboldened by victory and hardened by years of brutal warfare, saw them as spoils to be taken. Rape was widespread, often occurring during the first chaotic days of occupation, when there was no oversight and no restraint. Victims were rarely given a reason, and the assaults were frequently accompanied by beatings, humiliation, or threats. Attempts to resist could result in execution. Some women sought refuge in churches or hospitals, believing those spaces would be respected. But even these places were often violated. Others fled into forests or fields, hiding in the cold for days until the worst had passed. As the front pushed deeper into German territory, entire communities were uprooted. Columns of prisoners were marched eastward, many with no idea of their destination. Some would end up in labor camps, others in filtration centers where interrogations were conducted with brutal efficiency. Children were sometimes separated from their mothers, placed in state-run facilities, or sent to Soviet families as wards. For those left behind, daily life was reduced to survival, scavenging for food, securing shelter, and avoiding the attention of occupying troops. The psychological shock of the first encounters lingered long after the soldiers had moved on. People who had once lived in orderly, predictable communities now inhabit a landscape of fear and uncertainty. The familiar structures of authority, local officials, police, even neighbors, had vanished. In their place was a system of arbitrary power where anyone could be accused, detained, or assaulted without reason. Trust dissolved. People stopped speaking openly, stopped asking questions, stopped moving too far from home. Even the act of stepping outside to fetch water or gather firewood carried risk. By the time Soviet forces had secured their foothold in the eastern provinces, the world those civilians had known no longer existed. The arrival of the Red Army was not just a military event. It was a social and psychological rupture. Communities that had existed for centuries were erased or were scattered. Families were broken apart without explanation. And for countless women, the day the soldiers arrived marked the beginning of a trauma so deep and enduring that many would never speak of it again. The ordeal did not end with capture. For thousands of German women, the knock on the door, the shouted orders, and the march into the street were only the beginning of a far more harrowing journey, one that would strip them of dignity, strength, and often their lives before they ever reached a camp. Once gathered in town squares or railway yards, captives were sorted into groups and prepared for transport east. There were no explanations given and no promises of return. Some were told they would be interrogated and released. Others were accused of crimes they did not understand. Most were simply informed that they were being taken as part of reparations, a human debt to be repaid through labor in the Soviet Union. The first stage was almost always on foot. Columns of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women and girls were driven forward under the watch of armed guards, their bayonets glinting in the pale winter sun. Many wore only what they had been captured in: thin coats, worn shoes, dresses unsuitable for the journey ahead. Luggage was forbidden. Anything heavier than what one could carry in her hands was taken away. Some clutched small bundles of bread or photographs hidden in their clothing. Others held the hands of their children, refusing to let go even as soldiers barked orders to move faster. The sound of boots and hooves, the clatter of wagon wheels, and the sharp commands in Russian became the rhythm of their days. The marches were punishing from the very start. The winter of 1945 was one of the coldest in decades, and the unrelenting wind cut through layers of clothing, numbing fingers and faces until they turned white with frostbite. Food was scarce and often withheld altogether. Guards threw scraps of bread onto the road as if feeding animals, sometimes as a cruel joke, sometimes to keep the weakest moving. Water was a luxury. Prisoners scooped up handfuls of snow when they could, their lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. At night, they slept on frozen ground or in barns where the stench of livestock mingled with the stench of unwashed bodies and untreated wounds. Disease spread quickly through the columns. Dysentery and typhus, carried by lice and contaminated water, claimed lives before the first 100 miles were behind them. Those who could not walk were left behind in ditches, their bodies covered hastily with snow or simply abandoned. The guards rarely paused to bury the dead. There was no time, they said, and no reason. For every woman who collapsed from exhaustion, There were dozens more still marching. Some tried to help the weakest among them, sharing food or supporting them by the arm. Others, driven by sheer will to survive, hardened themselves against the suffering around them. The journey eastward could last for weeks. Some groups were marched hundreds of kilometers before reaching a railhead where they were packed into cattle cars, a grim relief in the endless walking, though the conditions inside were scarcely better. Others were never placed on trains at all, continuing their trek deep into Poland or Belarus on foot. Along the way, they passed through towns reduced to rubble and villages burned to ground, grim reminders of the destruction their own country had brought to Soviet soil. Locals sometimes jeered at them, throwing stones or spitting as they passed. In rare cases, peasants offered crusts of bread or a cup of water, small acts of kindness that prisoners remembered for the rest of their lives. Not all who began the march survived it. The death toll was staggering, from starvation, disease, cold, and sheer exhaustion. Women who had once lived comfortable, sheltered lives now found themselves scavenging for roots or chewing on bark to ease the ache of hunger. Feet blistered and bled inside worn-out shoes. Skin split open in the cold. Some women lost their sanity, babbling incoherently as they stumbled forward, while others went silent, their eyes fixed on the horizon as if staring far beyond the misery of the present. Even those who survived the march often spoke of it as the most dehumanizing part of their captivity. Camps at least offered some form of shelter, however brutal. The march offered none. It was an unending test of endurance, a deliberate stripping away of humanity designed to break both body and spirit before the real ordeal began. Many survivors would later say that it was on the road east, not in the labor camps or interrogation rooms, that they truly understood they were no longer people but property, commodities to be used and discarded. When they finally reached their destinations, transit depots, processing centers, or directly to Gulag camps, they arrived skeletal and hollow-eyed, their numbers diminished, their spirits frayed. Those who stepped off the march alive had passed through a crucible that would haunt them for decades. The memories of frozen nights spent huddled together for warmth, of friends collapsing in the snow and never rising again, of the endless horizon stretching before them with no end in sight, became scars etched deeper than any physical wound. For many, the long road east was not just a journey into captivity. It was a journey into a new existence, one where survival was no longer measured by the life they had known, but by the strength to endure what was still to come. The end of the march east did not bring the relief many women had clung to during those brutal weeks on the road. If anything, it marked the beginning of a new and more insidious phase of their captivity, one aimed not at their bodies, but at their very sense of self. Upon arrival at transit centers scattered across Soviet territory, they were no longer treated as civilians, as wives, mothers, or daughters. They were processed like captured soldiers or criminals, subjected to a systematic stripping away of everything that tied them to their former lives. It was a deliberate and calculated process designed to erase individuality and replace it with anonymity and guilt. The first step was confiscation. The women were ordered to empty their pockets and bags, to surrender anything they had managed to carry with them to the chaos of flight and capture. Documents were seized, birth certificates, passports, marriage licenses, letters, all collected and filed away or destroyed. These papers, once proof of identity and belonging, were suddenly meaningless in the eyes of their captors. Without them, they had no official existence, no name that mattered. The small personal items they had hidden away, a locket containing a child's photo, a folded prayer card, a diary, were pried from their hands or tossed onto piles of confiscated belongings. Even wedding rings, symbols of lives and promises made before the war, were wrenched from fingers, often in brutal, careless motions that left cuts and bruises behind. The confiscation was followed by interrogation. Soviet officers and NKVD agents questioned the women in bare, cold rooms under glaring lights. The questions were often absurdly broad or deliberately vague. What had they done during the war? Where had they worked? Whom had they known? Any answer could be twisted into evidence of complicity. A woman who had worked in a textile factory could be labeled a supplier of fascist uniforms. A nurse who had treated soldiers on the front was accused of aiding the Wehrmacht. A secretary who had once typed reports in a government office was now an enemy propagandist. There was no way to defend oneself, no chance to explain. The conclusions were preordained. When the interrogations ended, the transformation was formalized in paperwork. Names were often misspelled, shortened, or replaced entirely. Many women were never referred to by name again. Instead, they were assigned identification numbers, stamped on documents, shouted during roll calls, and scrawled across the fronts of their barracks uniforms. Some received cards bearing vague charges such as fascist worker, enemy element, or anti-Soviet agitator. These labels, imprecise and impersonal, were not accusations to be disproven. They were identities new, imposed, and inescapable. Once branded, there was no appeal. The psychological impact of this erasure was profound. For women who had spent the war trying to hold their families and communities together amid destruction, being reduced to a number was a blow deeper than any physical hardship. It was as if their past had been wiped clean, as if the lives they had once led had never existed. Mothers who had spent nights comforting terrified children, daughters who had cared for aging parents, teachers who had nurtured students, all of that was now irrelevant. They were enemies of the state, stripped of names, histories, and rights. The process extended beyond paperwork. Clothing was taken and replaced with coarse, shapeless garments that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. Hair was sometimes cut short under guise of hygiene, a further step in erasing individuality. Barracks assignments ignored family ties, scattering women who had traveled together and separating mothers from daughters. Even language was weaponized. Guards and officials referred to prisoners not as women or civilians, but as fascists, vermin, or simply. The relentless repetition of these terms wore down resistance, reshaping how many prisoners thought of themselves. The transformation was complete when the women realized that the past no longer held any power over their present. The lives they had once known, the homes they had kept, the people they had loved, the identities they had cherished, had been severed in a single bureaucratic gesture. They were now part of a vast and faceless system that did not care who they had been. Their only value lay in their labor, their silence, and their obedience. Some women tried desperately to cling to fragments of their identity. They whispered their full names to themselves before sleep, repeated their children's birthdays under their breath, or silently recited prayers learned in childhood. Others resisted more quietly, refusing to answer to their assigned numbers, even when beaten for disobedience. But most found that resistance was futile. The system was designed to crush individuality, and over time, even the strongest began to refer to themselves in the language their captors used. By the time they were loaded onto trains and sent deeper into the Soviet interior, the transformation was complete. They were no longer seen as people, but as resources, bodies to be used, statistics to be counted, and symbols of a defeated enemy. The women who had stepped off the march, still clinging to their past identities, were now unrecognizable even to themselves. Their names, their possessions, their sense of self, all of it had been stripped away, leaving behind only the hollow shell of what they had once been. It was not merely imprisonment. It was annihilation of personhood, and it was only the beginning of what lay ahead. The end of the march did not bring relief, only a different kind of nightmare. Those who survived the journey east were herded to the gates of processing centers that felt more like prisons than holding stations. Here, the final remnants of their former lives were systematically erased. Names, identities, and stories ceased to matter. Guards shouted orders as the women were separated into lines and stripped of their remaining possessions. Any documents that had survived the march, birth certificates, marriage papers, letters from home, were confiscated and thrown into piles, often burned as worthless scraps. Wedding rings were pried from fingers, pocket watches snatched from coats, family photographs ripped away with no explanation. Even clothing was sometimes taken and replaced with coarse, shapeless uniforms that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. The process was deliberately impersonal, designed to break any lingering sense of individuality. Prisoners were photographed and fingerprinted like criminals. Their names were replaced by numbers, and those numbers were how they would be known for the remainder of their captivity. Any attempt to explain who they were, that they had been school teachers, nurses, seamstresses, mothers, was dismissed as irrelevant. The only labels that mattered were those assigned by the authorities: fascist worker, enemy element, German national. These terms were stamped onto their files with mechanical indifference, sealing their fate without trial or testimony. The accusations were often absurdly vague. A woman might be classified as a Nazi collaborator simply because she had worked in a factory that once supplied uniforms to the Wehrmacht. Another might be deemed a war criminal because her husband had served in the army. Even those who had openly opposed the regime or hidden persecuted neighbors during the war were not exempt. Guilt was collective and innocence irrelevant. What mattered was that they were German, and that was enough to make them culpable. For many, the most painful moment came when their names were called for transport once more. They were loaded into trains without being told where they were going or how long they would be gone. Some clung to rumors that they would be released after a few weeks. Others heard whispers of 10-year sentences, or worse, indefinite detention. The truth was that few of them would ever see a courtroom or hear a formal verdict. They were not being punished for specific crimes. They were being absorbed into a vast system that needed labor. The Soviet Gulag network stretched across an entire continent, from the forests of the Urals to the frozen wastes of Siberia, from the coal mines of the Donbass to the construction sites along the Volga. It was a system built on secrecy and fear, where millions of people, political prisoners, criminals, soldiers, and civilians alike, disappeared into a landscape of barbed wire and watchtowers. For the German women swept up in its machinery, the experience was bewildering. They were marched off trains and into compounds surrounded by high fences and armed guards. The cold was often more brutal than anything they had endured during the march. Wind howled across open tundra, and the temperature in winter plunged so low that even breathing felt painful. Life inside the Gulag followed a rhythm that seemed designed to erase all sense of time. Days began before dawn with roll call and were filled with grueling labor, hauling timber, mining coal, digging ditches, or building roads. Meals consisted of thin soup and a scrap of bread, barely enough to sustain life. Yet ration cards were docked if work quotas were not met. Those too weak to labor were often sent to punishment barracks, where conditions were even worse. Disease was rampant. Frostbite, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread quickly in overcrowded barracks with no heating and little medical care. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest burden to bear. No one knew how long they would remain. Some were told they would be released after 2 years, only to see their terms extended indefinitely. Others simply vanished, taken away by guards and never seen again. Letters home were rare, and replies rarer still. Families in Germany often had no idea whether their mothers, daughters, or sisters were dead or alive. For the women themselves, time became meaningless. Weeks bled into months, months into years. Seasons changed, guards rotated, new prisoners arrived, but the gates never opened. Hope flickered occasionally, often sparked by rumors of prisoner exchanges or diplomatic negotiations. Sometimes women would be transferred to camps closer to Moscow, which they took as a sign that release might be near. More often, such movements meant only another assignment, another work detail, another year of captivity. In this world, survival required more than physical strength. It demanded an almost unnatural ability to endure monotony, deprivation, and despair. Prisoners formed fragile communities, sharing scraps of food, tending to the sick, and offering what emotional support they could. Friendships formed in the barracks often meant the difference between life and death. Yet even in these harsh conditions, the women clung to fragments of their former selves. They whispered memories of their homes, their children, the lives they had once led. They repeated their names to themselves quietly in the dark, as if refusing to let them be stolen completely. It was an act of defiance, small, invisible, but deeply human. In a system designed to erase them, that refusal to forget who they were became their last remaining form of resistance. Life inside the camps was defined by work, relentless, brutal, unending work that consumed every waking moment and reduced existence to the bare mechanics of survival. For most of the German women swept into the Gulag system, their days began before sunrise, when a guard shouted the clang of a metal rod on the barack door dragged them from the thin, lice-infested straw that passed for a bed. There was no time to fully wake, no moment to stretch or breathe. They stumbled into lines for roll call, shivering in the freezing dawn air, their breath forming white clouds as names, or more often numbers, were called and checked against lists. Anyone too weak to stand risked punishment. Anyone who stumbled or faltered might be beaten with rifle, but to force them upright, Once accounted for, the women were marched to their work sites, often several kilometers away. In the northern camps, the path wound through forests buried in snow, with the temperature in winter plunged far below freezing. Frostbitten fingers and toes were common, and each exhale burned like fire in the lungs. At logging camps, women swung axes far too heavy for their size, hacking at frozen trees with numb hands until their muscles ached and their skin split open. The trees they felled were dragged by hand or loaded onto sledges, then hauled toward rail depots where they would be shipped to fuel Soviet industry. It was labor designed for men in their physical prime, but here it was done by women already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. In the coal mines, conditions were even more punishing. Prisoners descended into dark, damp tunnels where they shoveled coal under the constant threat of cave-ins, gas leaks, or suffocation. Dust coated their skin and filled their lungs, and the air was so thick with grit that coughing fits were a daily occurrence. Some women collapsed mid-shift and were dragged away like broken machinery, their places quickly filled by others. At brickworks and construction sites, the rhythm was no less unforgiving. Women mixed mortar, hauled heavy stones, and worked long hours without proper tools. On collective farms, they trudged behind plows, sowed fields, or harvested crops by hand, often working from dawn until dusk under the eyes of armed overseers. The workday could stretch to 12 or 14 hours, broken only by a brief midday pause to consume the meager ration of thin cabbage soup and a small piece of black bread. These rations were nowhere near enough to sustain the level of physical labor required, and malnutrition was rampant. Women's bodies wasted away, their cheeks hollowing and their limbs becoming frail. Hair fell out in clumps. Menstrual cycles stopped entirely. The constant hunger gnawed at them like a second presence, dominating their thoughts even more than the cold or the pain. It was common for prisoners to dream of food, of loaves of bread, of butter and meat, only to wake to the same watery broth and stale crust. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Falling trees crushed those too slow to move, carts overturned and pinned workers beneath them, and crude machinery mangled hands and arms. Medical care was rudimentary at best. A makeshift infirmary might exist, but supplies were minimal and doctors scarce. Minor injuries often became life-threatening infections, and diseases like dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through the camps unchecked. Death was so common that it ceased to be remarked upon. Bodies were carried out at dawn and buried in shallow graves beyond the perimeter fence, sometimes without even a marker. Yet perhaps the most insidious part of the system was the way it drained not just the body but the will. Work became a kind of mechanical existence, a monotonous, numbing cycle that left no space for thought or memory. Days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and pain. The only markers of time were the changing seasons and the gradual attrition of those around them. One by one, familiar faces disappeared, carried away by disease, accidents, or the sheer inability to endure. New arrivals took their place, hollow-eyed and terrified, only to follow the same slow decline. Some prisoners tried to cling to their humanity in small, fragile ways. A woman might hum a lullaby under her breath as she worked, remembering the child she had left behind. Another might carve a hidden mark into a tree or a brick wall to remind herself that she still existed beyond the number assigned to her. Others formed quiet packs to share food, to help one another lift a heavy load, to keep each other from collapsing. These acts of solidarity did not change the reality of the situation, but they offered moments of dignity in a system designed to erase it. For many, death came long before the war itself ended. They died not from bullets or bombs, but from hunger, exposure, exhaustion, and neglect. Their bodies fed the earth they had been forced to till, their bones buried beneath the roads and factories they had helped build. Those who survived did so not because they were stronger or more resilient, but often simply because chance, a less severe illness, a lighter workload, an extra scrap of bread, had been on their side. And as they lay down each night in their cold, overcrowded barracks, they knew that the next day would bring no change. The war that had begun with soldiers and tanks was now being fought inside their bodies, against starvation, despair, and the slow, grinding machinery of a system that saw them not as people, but as tools to be used until they broke. There was one subject that most survivors never spoke of, even to those closest to them. It was the unspoken weight that lived behind their eyes, the memory they buried deeper than any other, the one that no post-war tribunal could erase. For countless German women captured on the Eastern Front, the violence did not end with forced marches or brutal labor. It followed them into the barracks, the forests, the abandoned houses, and the hidden corners of the camps. It came in the form of men in uniform, men who had marched across half of Europe to avenge their homeland, and who, in their rage and power, reduced their prisoners to objects of conquest. The sexual violence inflicted by Soviet soldiers and guards was not incidental. It was widespread, systematic, and devastating. Women of every age were targeted. Teenagers barely out of childhood, mothers with infants, widows in their 50s. No one was spared because of status, appearance, or circumstance. Rape occurred in bombed-out farmhouses as troops advanced westward, in barns and basements during the first chaotic days of occupation, and later within the confines of prison camps, where guards wielded total control over every aspect of life. Some assaults happened publicly, as soldiers demonstrated their dominance before their comrades. Others took place in the dead of night, carried out by individuals who knew there would be no consequences. For many soldiers, this violence was framed as vengeance, not just against the German state, but against the German people themselves. They had seen their villages destroyed, their families slaughtered, and their country brought to the brink of annihilation. Propaganda had taught them that German women were not innocents, but the mothers and wives of men who had invaded their homeland. Now, they reasoned, these women would pay for crimes of their nation. Such rationalizations made the violence easier to commit and easier for superiors to ignore. While the Soviet High Command occasionally issued orders forbidding the abuse of civilians, enforcement was rare and inconsistent. Most perpetrators acted with impunity, knowing that their victims had no recourse and no voice. The consequences of this violence were catastrophic. Physical injuries were common: torn bodies, untreated infections, pregnancies born of assault. Some women were raped repeatedly over weeks or months, their bodies treated as spoils of war by multiple men. Others were assaulted once, but never escaped the psychological aftermath. The trauma manifested in nightmares, trembling fits, sudden silences, an overwhelming sense of shame that often lasted for the rest of their lives. For many, the humiliation was compounded by the fear of being blamed. They worried that their suffering would be seen not as a crime against them, but as evidence of their own weakness or dishonor. Pregnancy was perhaps the most devastating legacy of this violence. Countless children were conceived through rape, and their mothers were forced to make impossible decisions in a world that offered them no support. Some gave birth in the camps, raising their children in squalid conditions, while guards mocked them for bearing enemy blood. Others abandoned or gave up their babies out of desperation, unable to reconcile the child with the memory of their violation. Many never spoke of these children again, even after returning home, and some families grew up unaware of the truth of their origins. After the war, silence became a survival strategy. The social climate in both East and West Germany left little room for women to speak openly about what had happened to them. In the Soviet occupation zone, discussion of Soviet crimes was strictly forbidden. Any attempt to document or report sexual violence risked arrest and imprisonment. In the West, women often found that their suffering was minimized or dismissed, overshadowed by broader narratives of national guilt and reconstruction. To admit to being raped carried a deep stigma, one that could destroy marriages, reputations, and entire lives. And so, they remained silent. They told no one, not their children, not their husbands, not even their closest friends. This silence persisted for decades. Only in old age, often near the end of their lives, did some women begin to speak, recording testimonies or writing memoirs that they knew might only be published after their deaths. These accounts reveal not only the scale of the violence, but the depth of its psychological toll. Many survivors described feeling as though a part of them had died during those assaults, that their sense of self had been irreparably fractured. Others spoke of living for years with the belief that they no longer had the right to joy, love, or even life itself. The silence that followed the violence was itself a form of imprisonment, one that outlasted the camps and the Soviet occupation. It isolated survivors from one another, kept their suffering invisible, and erased their stories from public memory. And yet, beneath that silence, the trauma endured, passed down in subtle ways to children and grandchildren who never fully understood the weight their mothers and grandmothers carried. The violence that was meant to humiliate and destroy had left scars deeper than anyone could see, shaping lives long after the soldiers had gone home. It was a wound they never spoke of, the war they continued to fight long after the guns had fallen silent. Survival in the camps depended on more than endurance. Strength of body alone was rarely enough to outlast the relentless labor, the starvation, the cold, and the cruelty. What often kept women alive was something quieter, more fragile, and infinitely more powerful: the bond they formed with one another in the shadows of oppression. These bonds, built in whispered conversations, stolen moments, and shared scraps of bread, became a form of resistance, a way of asserting humanity in a system designed to erase it. At first, trust was nearly impossible. The Gulag was a place where betrayal could mean the difference between life and death, where an unguarded word might reach the ears of a guard or informant and bring punishment to an entire barrack. Many women withdrew into themselves, wary of speaking, wary even of looking others in the eye. But over time, necessity eroded those walls. Hunger, illness, grief, none of these could be endured alone for long. Slowly, cautiously, women began to reach out to one another. A crust of bread, quietly placed in another's hand. A torn piece of cloth offered as a bandage. A word of comfort spoken when someone wept into the darkness. These small gestures became the foundation of informal support networks that wove themselves through the camp's rigid structure. Women organized themselves into small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3, and pooled their resources. One might barter with a guard for an extra ladle of soup. Another might patch torn clothing or help carry wood for those too weak to stand. Food, when it came, was divided carefully. Those who were sick or injured were given larger portions, while the stronger went hungry for a day. It was a delicate, often painful system, but it allowed more of them to survive than would have otherwise. Beyond physical aid, these networks offered emotional lifelines. In the long hours after work, when the barracks were silent except for the wind outside and the sound of labored breathing, women shared stories. They spoke of their homes, the smell of bread baking in an oven, the sound of bells in their village, the faces of children they might never see again. These memories, fragile and bittersweet, reminded them that they were still human beings with histories and futures, not just numbers in a labor ledger. Some even began to teach one another their languages. Germans learned Russian phrases. Poles taught snippets of songs. Ukrainians shared folk tales. These exchanges were more than practical. They were a way to rebuild bridges in a world that had been divided by war and hatred. For some, survival meant holding on to memory in a more tangible way. Despite the ever-present risk of discovery, a few women kept secret diaries. They wrote on scraps of paper hidden in the lining of clothes or etched words into pieces of wood and fabric. These records were often brief: a date, a weather report, a single sentence describing a death or a small kindness. But they were acts of defiance, a refusal to let the narrative of their lives be written solely by their captors. Many knew that if they were caught, the punishment would be severe, perhaps fatal. Still, they continued, convinced that even if they did not survive, someone might one day read their words and know what had happened here. Another form of resistance came through care for the dying. In a place where death was routine and often ignored, choosing to sit beside someone in their final hours was an act of profound courage. Women held hands as life ebbed away, whispered prayers, or simply refused to let another person die alone. It was not something they were ordered to do, nor something that brought any material reward. But in those small gestures, a hand wiped clean, a whispered goodbye, they reclaimed a sliver of dignity for themselves and for the person slipping away. Occasionally, even amid despair, moments of laughter pierced the gloom. A crude joke whispered during a work shift, a mock fashion show where women paraded in their tattered uniforms, a shared memory that sent a ripple of giggles through the barracks. These moments were fleeting, but they mattered deeply. They reminded the women that they were more than their suffering. That joy, even the smallest, most fragile kind, was still possible. None of these acts could change the brutal reality of the camps. They did not stop the hunger, the cold, or the death that stalked them daily. But they did something equally vital. They preserved the essence of what it meant to be human. In a world built to crush their spirit, these women created spaces, however small, however hidden, where compassion, solidarity, and memory could still exist. It was in these spaces that many found the strength to keep going one more day, and then another and another after that. For some, that was enough to survive until liberation. For others, it was enough to know that even if they did not live to see freedom, they had not allowed their captors to destroy the most essential part of them. The silence was perhaps the cruelest part of captivity. In the brutal world of camps, harsher even than the march east or the forced labor that followed, it was the absence of voices from home, the lack of news from loved ones, that slowly hollowed people out from within. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there were no letters, no parcels, no official notices. For most women, the last time they had heard a familiar voice was the day they were taken from their homes. Everything that had once connected them to their previous lives, the laughter of their children, the sound of church bells in their village, the simple comfort of a husband's hand, dissolved into an unbroken silence that stretched on without end. Letters, in theory, were possible. Prisoners were sometimes told they could write 1 or 2 a year, short notes that would be censored and read by Soviet authorities. But many never saw even this small chance. Requests to send messages were ignored, paper was denied, or the letters they wrote disappeared into the bureaucratic void of the camp system, never to be delivered. On rare occasions when a message did leave the camp, it often took months or even years to reach its destination, if it arrived at all. Families in Germany would receive thin, yellowed envelopes bearing strange Soviet stamps and short, cryptic lines. "I am alive. Do not worry. Hope you are well." The words were carefully chosen, scrubbed of any hint of the suffering behind them. Anything that might hint at mistreatment or despair was removed by the censors. The result was that even the few messages that did get through felt distant, incomplete, and unreal, like ghosts of the women who had written them. For many families, no such messages ever came. Mothers waited at kitchen tables long after the war had ended, scanning the mail for news that never arrived. Husbands remarried, believing their wives had perished. Children grew up assuming their mothers were dead, their earliest memories fading into half-remembered stories. The Red Cross attempted to trace the missing, but Soviet authorities often refused to provide information, citing security reasons or denying that the individuals were even in custody. Requests for information vanished into silence. It was not uncommon for decades to pass before families learned that a wife or daughter had survived, and by then, the lives they had left behind were gone beyond recovery. Inside the camps, the absence of communication became a torment of its own. The women speculated endlessly about what might be happening at home. Was their town still standing? Were their parents alive? Had their children been evacuated, or had they perished in the bombings? The questions circled endlessly with no answers, gnawing at them during long work shifts and sleepless nights. Hope flickered and dimmed in cycles. Some convinced themselves that their families must have forgotten them. Others clung stubbornly to the belief that someone, somewhere, was waiting, that a mother still prayed for their return, that a child still remembered their face. The uncertainty warped their sense of time. Without letters or news, the outside world seemed to recede into unreality. Seasons passed, but they had no idea how many years had gone by. The war had ended, but many did not know it for months. Political events, rebuilding efforts, and social changes happened beyond the fences, but inside the camps, nothing changed. The only reality was a daily struggle to survive, and the distant, unreachable world beyond the barbed wire became a kind of dream, a dream that grew fainter with each unanswered letter. For some women, the silence bred despair so deep it was impossible to climb out of. They stopped asking questions, stopped trying to write, stopped speaking of home altogether. It was easier to believe that there was no one left to care. Others responded in the opposite way. They spoke constantly of their families, reciting names, recounting memories, weaving elaborate fantasies of reunions that might never happen. These stories, however fragile, gave them something to hold on to, a reason to endure another day. The impact of this communication blackout extended far beyond the camp walls. When survivors did finally return, sometimes years after the war had ended, they often found their places in the world had been erased. Children did not recognize them. Husbands had built new lives. Parents had died without ever knowing their daughters were still alive. The silence that had haunted them in captivity now followed them into freedom, shaping how they were received and how they rebuilt their lives. Some chose never to speak of what had happened, unwilling to reopen wounds or explain the long absence. Others tried and failed to bridge the gulf that years of silence had carved between them and those they loved. In the end, the lack of communication was more than a logistical failure. It was a weapon of erasure. It severed ties, destroyed identities, and left scars that time alone could not heal. For many women, the war did not end with liberation from the camps. It lingered in the empty spaces of their lives, in the children who no longer knew them, the homes that no longer felt like home, and the unanswered messages that had once been their last desperate link to a world beyond the wire. The war had ended years earlier, yet for thousands of German women scattered across the Gulag system, it felt as if the world had forgotten them. Seasons came and went beyond the camp fences. New flags rose over their homeland, and Europe began rebuilding itself from the rubble. But inside the sprawling archipelago of labor colonies stretching from the Urals to Siberia, time seemed frozen. The women who had been marched east as prisoners in 1945 were still felling trees, hauling coal, and scraping frozen soil in 1947, 1948, even 1949. The Soviet state had no urgency to release them. They were part of the reparations, a human workforce extracted as payment for a war that had shattered the USSR. Their sentences were rarely formalized. Their release dates never communicated. Many no longer believed they would ever go home. It was only after the geopolitical landscape shifted, as the early tensions of the Cold War began to shape diplomacy, that the question of repatriation slowly returned to the table. By 1948, Western pressure mounted for the release of remaining German civilians, and Soviet authorities, eager to present a more cooperative image on the world stage, began to relent. Repatriation did not come all at once. It happened in waves, sporadic and unpredictable. Lists would circulate suddenly in the camps, names read out with little warning. Some women were told they were going home only hours before they were marched to trains. Others waited for months after hearing rumors of release that never materialized. The uncertainty that had defined their captivity clung to them until the very last moment. The journey home was often as difficult as the one that brought them east, though now they were older, weaker, and broken in ways that were not always visible. Many had spent 3, 5, even 7 years in the Gulag, long enough for their bodies to bear permanent scars from malnutrition and overwork. Some had lost teeth to scurvy, their bones brittle from calcium deficiency. Others limped from untreated injuries sustained years before. Illness followed them onto the transport trains. Tuberculosis, chronic respiratory conditions, and parasitic infections spread easily in the crowded rail cars that carried them westward. Deaths during transport were not uncommon. For those who survived the journey, the first sight of Germany was surreal. The country they had left was gone. The cities lay in ruins, divided now into zones controlled by foreign powers. Flags they did not recognize flew over government buildings. New currencies were in circulation, and the people, those who had endured the bombing campaigns, the hunger winters, and the occupation, had changed too. The returning women were strangers in their own land. They spoke German with accents shaped by years of Russian. They had learned Soviet songs, Soviet habits, Soviet silences. Some had forgotten how to speak freely at all, conditioned by years of fear that every word could be overheard and punished. Homecomings were rarely joyful reunions. Many families had long since given up hope, believing their loved ones had perished in the chaos of 1945. Husbands had remarried. Children had grown up calling other women mother. Parents had died without ever knowing whether their daughters were alive. For the survivors, these discoveries were devastating. They had endured captivity with the dream of returning to familiar arms and familiar places, only to find that those places no longer existed. The sense of alienation was profound. Some returned to find their homes occupied by strangers. Others were met with suspicion, accused of collaborating with the Soviets, or shamed for having survived at all. The war had rewritten the moral language of society, and many who had lived through unimaginable suffering were now treated as if their survival was a stain rather than a testament to their strength. The psychological wounds were deeper still. Years of violence, degradation, and silence did not fade with the crossing of a border. Nightmares haunted their sleep. Sudden noises sent them recoiling in fear. They avoided crowds and public spaces, overwhelmed by the noise and abundance of a world they no longer felt part of. Many were unable or unwilling to speak about what they had endured. When they tried, they were often met with discomfort or disbelief. Post-war Germany, focused on reconstruction and economic recovery, had little appetite for stories that complicated its narrative of victimhood and renewal. And so, the women kept their memories locked away, hidden even from those closest to them. For some, the struggle to reintegrate proved too great. They withdrew from society, living out their lives in quiet isolation. Others tried to rebuild, finding solace in work, family, or faith. A few drew strength from the very suffering they had endured, becoming advocates for reconciliation or documenting their stories in memoirs decades later. But even those who built new lives carried their past with them like a shadow, an unspoken truth that shaped their relationships, their worldview, and their understanding of themselves. The long road home was not simply a journey across distance. It was a passage through layers of loss, the loss of youth, of health, of family, of identity. Liberation did not mean restoration. It meant starting again from the ruins of a life that could never be fully recovered. And for many of these women, even as they walked the streets of their homeland once more, a part of them remained behind in the endless forests, the frozen barracks, and the nameless graves of the East. Returning to Germany was supposed to mean safety, freedom, and an end to suffering. Yet for many of the women who had spent years in Soviet captivity, stepping back onto German soil felt like entering another kind of exile. The land was familiar, but they were not. Their country had changed while they were gone, and so had they. And instead of open arms and understanding, they were often met with silence, suspicion, and judgment. The homes they had dreamed of during endless nights in the camps no longer existed, and the people they had imagined waiting for them were not always glad to see them return. The post-war years were defined by trauma for everyone. Germany itself was broken. Cities reduced to rubble, millions displaced, and the national psyche shattered by defeat and occupation. People were struggling to survive, rebuild, and forget. In that atmosphere, there was little room for the stories of those who had endured years of imprisonment in the Soviet Union. When the women tried to speak about what had happened, they were often met with discomfort or disbelief. Neighbors changed the subject. Employers dismissed their accounts as exaggerations. Even family members urged them to put the past behind them. Society wanted to move on, and their suffering did not fit neatly into the narrative of national recovery. For many, the silence was not just external but imposed. There were things they could not say, or dared not say, for fear of what people would think. Sexual violence, in particular, was a subject cloaked in deep shame. Women who had been assaulted in the camps often found that revealing the truth brought condemnation rather than compassion. They were accused of having consorted with the enemy, or being somehow complicit in their own abuse. Some were shunned by their communities. Others were rejected by their husbands, who could not bear the thought of what had happened or who blamed them for dishonoring the family. In this environment, many survivors learned to keep their experiences hidden, locking them away as private burdens never to be spoken aloud. Accusations of collaboration were common as well, because they had survived, because they had returned when so many had not. People assumed they must have cooperated with their captors. Rumors circulated that they had worked willingly for the Soviets, that they had betrayed secrets or served as informants. None of it was true. Survival itself required nothing more than endurance, but in a society eager to find explanations and villains, suspicion came easily. Women who had once been respected members of their communities found themselves ostracized or ignored. Their years of suffering did not earn them sympathy. Instead, they became marks against them, reasons to be distrusted. The weight of this social rejection shaped every part of their lives. Many returned to find their families fractured or gone entirely. Husbands had remarried, assuming their wives were dead. Children had grown up without them and no longer felt a bond. Some women were strangers in their own homes, sleeping in spare rooms or being treated as unwanted guests. The emotional distance was often worse than the physical hardships of the camps. It reinforced the sense that they no longer belonged, not to their families, not to their towns, not even the country they had once called home. Faced with this hostility and indifference, Many women chose silence as a survival strategy. They built new lives without ever speaking of the old. They told their children that they had worked in the East during the war or that they had been displaced by bombing raids. They avoided questions and burned what few documents or letters they had brought back with them. Some never revealed the truth, even on their deathbeds. To speak about it, they believed, would only bring shame to themselves, to their families, to their children. The past became a secret carried quietly, shaping everything but rarely spoken aloud. Yet the silence was not without cost. It weighed heavily on their health and their relationships. Nightmares persisted, and sudden sounds or gestures could trigger memories of violence and humiliation. Many women struggled with depression and a profound sense of isolation, feeling as though the world around them was moving forward while they remained trapped in the past. The trauma was compounded by the absence of recognition. There were no monuments to their suffering, no public acknowledgments, no compensation. Their experiences were not written into history books or discussed in classrooms. They were simply erased, not denied outright, but ignored into oblivion. Some tried to find solace in each other's company. Small informal groups of former prisoners would meet quietly in church basements or private homes, sharing stories they could not tell anyone else. In those rare spaces, they spoke the truth without fear of judgment, offering each other the understanding that society refused to give them. These gatherings were lifelines, fragile but essential. They reminded the women that they were not alone, that their suffering had meaning, and that their silence was not the same as forgetting. But for most, the post-war years were marked by a deep, enduring disconnection. They were home, yet not home. The soil beneath their feet was familiar, but it no longer felt like theirs. The language they spoke sounded strange in their own mouths. They moved through streets lined with ruins not only of buildings, but trust, belonging, and identity. And though they had survived unimaginable horrors, the world they returned to often made them feel as though they had never truly come back at all. For decades, the stories of German women who endured captivity in the Soviet Union remained buried beneath layers of silence. It was not merely a personal choice to remain quiet. It was a silence imposed by society, by politics, and by shame. Post-war Germany had little interest in hearing about the suffering of its own citizens, particularly when it came at the hands of the victors. The Cold War added another layer of suppression. Speaking critically about Soviet actions could be seen as politically dangerous in East Germany and diplomatically inconvenient in the West. And so, an entire generation of women carried their stories privately, locked behind guarded expressions and deflections, their experiences reduced to half-sentences or vague references that betrayed none of the truth. But silence, however deeply entrenched, is not eternal. By the late 1980s, the world around these women began to change. The Soviet Union was crumbling, archives were opening, and public conversations about the past were taking new directions. Germany itself was undergoing transformation, not just politically, with reunification on the horizon, but culturally, with a renewed interest in confronting the darker, more complex legacies of the war. Historians began asking new questions. Journalists probed into long-ignored stories, and survivors, many now elderly, felt time pressing against them. They realized that if they did not speak soon, their stories might die with them. The first accounts emerged tentatively. Some were interviews conducted by historians who had spent years seeking out former prisoners willing to talk. Others appeared as memoirs, often self-published, written in plain, unpolished prose by women who had never before shared their experiences. These narratives were raw and deeply personal, recounting events that had been suppressed even within families. They described the bitter cold of the marches east, the relentless labor in forest mines, the hunger that gnawed through bone, and the despair of letters that never came. They spoke, too, of the violence that haunted them most deeply, the sexual assaults that scarred their bodies and psyches, the shame that had silenced them for decades. For many readers, these testimonies were a revelation. The public had long known about German soldiers who had been taken prisoner in the Soviet Union. Their harsh treatment was documented and discussed, even memorialized. But the plight of civilian women had been almost entirely absent from the historical record. The realization that tens of thousands had been deported, enslaved, assaulted, and left to languish in distant labor camps forced a rethinking of what post-war suffering meant. Their stories complicated the dominant narratives of victimhood and guilt, reminding the world that even among the defeated there were layers of vulnerability and injustice that had gone unacknowledged. The act of speaking was not easy. Many women described feeling as though they were reliving their trauma as they wrote or spoke. Some broke down during interviews, unable to continue. Others worried that they would still face judgment, that their words would be twisted into excuses for Germany's wartime aggression or dismissed as exaggerations. But something fundamental had shifted. They no longer feared being disbelieved. In a society now more willing to confront uncomfortable truths, they found audiences ready to listen, historians, students, journalists, and even younger family members who had long sensed a hidden story behind their mother's or grandmother's silences. As testimonies accumulated, they began to reshape public memory. Television documentaries aired interviews with survivors who, often for the first time, spoke openly about the abuses they had suffered. Academic conferences devoted sessions to the deportation of German civilians. Museums and memorials incorporated their stories into exhibits, placing their suffering within the broader narrative of 20th century displacement and forced labor. What had once been hidden in the private realm of shame was now becoming part of the collective historical record. For the survivors themselves, telling their stories was often a profoundly cathartic experience. Many described a sense of liberation, as if shedding a burden they had carried for a lifetime. Some found reconciliation with family members who finally understood the reasons for their emotional distance or silence. Others found solace in connecting with fellow survivors, forming networks and associations that allowed them to support one another and advocate for recognition. And while the past could not be undone, the act of speaking reclaimed a measure of dignity, a way of asserting that their suffering had mattered, that their lives were more than the silence they had been forced to live in. The late testimonies of these women did more than document a forgotten chapter of history. They challenged simplistic narratives of war, showing how its violence extended far beyond the battlefield and continued to shape lives long after the guns fell silent. They revealed how trauma could be inherited, how silence itself could become a legacy passed down through generations. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded the world that even in the darkest chapters of history, truth has a way of emerging, not loudly or easily, but persistently, in the trembling voices of those who refuse to let their suffering remain invisible. By the time the 20th century came to a close, the women who had once been voiceless were finally shaping how history would remember them. And in doing so, they ensured that their pain and their endurance would never again be erased. The legacy of the women who endured Soviet captivity is not written only in archives or memorial plaques. It lingers in the quiet spaces of history, in the stories that were never told, in the pauses between sentences, in the silences that stretched across decades. Their suffering, long hidden and often dismissed, forces us to confront a deeper truth about war and its aftermath, that the violence of conflict does not end when the shooting stops. It seeps into the fabric of societies, shaping lives long after treaties are signed, altering how generations remember, relate, and rebuild. For much of the 20th century, the absence of these women's voices distorted the historical record. The dominant narratives of World War II focus on armies and generals, on battles and treaties, on the great political shifts that redrew borders and toppled empires. Civilian suffering, especially the suffering of women, was often relegated to margins, seen as secondary or inevitable. But the testimonies that began to emerge in the late 20th century changed that. They revealed a dimension of war that could not be captured by casualty statistics or military maps. They showed how state violence extended beyond soldiers to ordinary people, how vengeance blurred the line between combatant and civilian, and how captivity and abuse could continue long after a nation's surrender. The silence that surrounded these stories was not a sign of weakness, as it was sometimes interpreted. It was, in many cases, a survival mechanism. Speaking could mean ostracism, disbelief, or re-traumatization. Remaining silent allowed many women to protect what remained of their dignity and to preserve the fragile relationships they returned to. It was a way of navigating a post-war world that was not prepared to hear them, a world more comfortable forgetting than remembering. Their silence itself became a testament to resilience, a refusal to be defined entirely by victimhood, a choice to build lives amid the wreckage rather than remain trapped in it. Yet the cost of that silence was profound. It left generations without the full truth of what had happened. Families grew up with gaps in their histories, with questions that were never answered. The trauma of captivity and violence did not disappear simply because it was not spoken. It manifested in other ways, in strained relationships, in emotional distance, in patterns of fear and mistrust passed down to children and grandchildren. Historians now understand that trauma can be inherited not just biologically but culturally, carried forward to behaviors and silences. The legacy of these women's suffering, then, is not confined to their lifetimes. It lives on in the families and societies that were shaped by what they could not say. Their stories also complicate how we understand guilt and responsibility. For decades, German suffering was a taboo subject, overshadowed, rightly, by the enormity of the crimes the Nazi regime committed. But acknowledging the atrocities of the Third Reich does not require ignoring the suffering of ordinary civilians, many of whom had no power over the machinery of war. The experiences of these women remind us that war does not offer simple categories of victim and perpetrator. People can be both, members of a nation that caused unimaginable harm and victims of retaliation that stripped them of humanity. This complexity deepens our understanding of history rather than diminishing it. In the end, the legacy of their unspoken suffering is a lesson about the nature of war itself. It teaches us that the consequences of conflict are not contained by geography or time. They ripple outward, touching those far from the front lines and persisting long after the last soldier has returned home. They shape how nations remember and how they reconcile. They force societies to grapple with uncomfortable truths, not just about what was done in their name, but about what was done to them. Today, as scholars, descendants, and survivors themselves continue to piece together the fragmented record of these women's lives, their silence speaks as powerfully as their words. It tells us about the burden of memory and the cost of survival. It reminds us that history is not only written in speeches and monuments, but also in the choices people make to endure, to rebuild, and sometimes to forget. And it challenges us to listen, not just to what was said, but to what was never voiced. The women who returned from Soviet captivity carried more than physical scars. They carried the weight of a history that had no place in public memory, a history that for decades existed only in their bodies and their silences. Yet by surviving, by building families, by contributing to the reconstruction of a ruined country, by living despite everything, they shaped the post-war world in ways that are only now becoming visible. Their endurance is part of the story of Europe's recovery, as essential as the political treaties and economic plans that rebuilt its cities. And their silence, once a burden, now stands as a monument in its own right, a testament to human capacity to endure the unendurable, and a reminder that the echoes of war continue long after the guns fall silent.